Good morning. Welcome to Pivot Point. This is a special episode in the Pivot Point series about coalitions and an example of when coalitions break down, what happens. So welcome to Blame It on the Boomers, a special episode of Pivot Point here at our studios in Haines City, Central Florida. Pivot Point, as you know, is a moderate position, and we're going to talk about moderation, but we're also going to talk about radicalism. I try and make these early episodes basically evergreen, and I will, but I can't live without talking about something that happened more recently, within the last few days, and that was the murder of Minnesota legislators by a radical. I'm not going to say that it's a Republican. Obviously he is, but it's a radical, and we had that problem from all sides with radicals, and we solved that problem by being a moderate. And we're going to talk about some of these issues and a little bit about my youth and what I saw growing up and what I know now and what that means. So welcome to Pivot Point, and let's get into it. I was born in Newark, New Jersey, at a hospital called Beth Israel, affectionately known as the Beth. My parents were the generation that is now called the greatest generation. Their parents were both incredibly poor. My grandparents lived in poor housing and in the projects of Newark. My grandmother lived in the projects of Newark till after my grandfather passed away, and she moved to a new senior complex down the road from the Frelinghuysen Avenue projects in Newark, New Jersey, that she lived in. It was a tall building. She was on the 17th floor. And in 1967, as the summer grew warm, we stood out on her patio and we looked at the scene forming below us, because the riots of Newark had begun and the National Guard had been called in and they were setting up their bivouac within sight. And I sat there and watched. In 67, I was a 12-year-old kid. You can't imagine how that affected me. Of course, as the days wore on and we could hear the gunshots from downtown Newark, and we knew the areas where the rioting was taking place, it had a big effect on me. The most important area that was destroyed was an area called Springfield Avenue, and it went down from Newark to Irvington and Maplewood. But Springfield Avenue in Newark is the heart of where the riots took place. It was a retail community populated mostly by Jews. In those days, the Jewish and African American communities were aligned, and as the riot began, they were still aligned. The riot is an indication of the breakdown of the middle. It's the radicals' claim to power. We can't do anything that doesn't involve blank, 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 blank. Perhaps, but I don't think that the solution to Newark's problems were the riots on Springfield Avenue. Additionally, all through that area, Jews and blacks were living together. Something happened, and I'll tell you, the story that I remember is that the words written are different than when I looked up the history and checked on it. The words I heard were B.O.B., black-owned business, but what it apparently was Soul Bro. And the Soul Bro writing on a business meant that the rioters would not burn it down. These poor shopkeepers begged the rioters not to destroy their businesses. They reminded them of the coalition. They said, we sent our children on the bus rides into the South to risk their lives because we stood together. Now we need you to stand with us, protect our little businesses. You worked for me. Your father came to me. Your family, I fed your family. That's what they asked. And Springfield Avenue burned, and the Jews of Newark began to take flight in what called white flight. But it wasn't just people who were white. It was the moderates who left Newark to the radical. 130-something people were shot by the National Guard after the rioting had already gone on for days, after there was nothing left. It was just arbitrary shooting. And these forced combat situation, these forced radicals, are what we're talking about today. A moderate would never say, if people are legally protesting and you feel threatened anyhow, you can run them over. The governor of our state gave people permission to run each other over if you didn't agree with the politics. That is not moderate politics. That is radicalism. And that is violence. And instigating violence from any side is a shameful thing. But when an elected politician looking to gain national office uses that kind of rhetoric to further his nefarious schemes to move ahead, this is a problem. I could forgive him for the fight with Disney. I could forgive him for his wife's theft and open stealing of political money that she had no right to touch and gave to people who were friends of his. I could forgive all of that. But ordering people, giving people permission to murder each other because of their politics, we need a change. We need a change right now. And that's the change that we have coming. Because what is not going to happen in Central Florida or throughout Florida is what happened those August days in 1967 in my hometown of Newark, New Jersey. I would speak to you about some of the people from Newark I know, but I couldn't speak without talking about one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, who was formerly the mayor of Newark, Cory Booker. I met Cory Booker working on the Democratic policy for Bill Clinton's second run. And I believe we've been friends ever since. I have a lot of respect for him. But his solutions and his actions are not those of the radicals. He is not an AOC. He is not a Bernie Sanders. He is a moderate. And he's a moderate because he saw what happened when the radicals took charge of his community. And he was left with the aftermath. Burnt out buildings, poor schools, frightened people, lower tax base. This is the America that we are left with under the radicals. And I ask you to begin to work together to form a moderate coalition. We had moderate coalitions. We had moderate coalitions for many years, but we don't have them now. I want to talk about how we got there. And then after I talk about that, I'm going to tell you what I learned. Thought I knew everything, but what I learned. And the answer of what I learned is whose fault it was. It was the boomers' fault. We moved the country to a stance of radicalism because we were fighting to end a war. And we used radical politics to end that war. And those tactics, in other ways, came back to haunt us and have come back to haunt us now. And the murders in Minnesota of the legislators is exactly what we're going to see everywhere. This effort I am doing is not just to instruct Democrats, Republicans, and independents. It's also, maybe, to save the lives of people who are having their lives endangered because of this radicalism. And the number one target is Donald Trump. These shootings are not just going random. He is the leader. He is the man who sits at the desk where the buck stops, and he is the man who is most endangered. And so if you are a Republican and you love Donald Trump, you need to calm him down. Because people are out there hunting for him right now. Those people, some of them were shooting other places, but this is not something new. So we're back to Newark, and I'm talking about the Newark I grew up with. My relatives, in every way they could, no matter what it took, moved out of the city of Newark, leaving it with a lower tax base and with great many problems. Those problems had been solved, had been working on by Jews and blacks working together. So as we look at this trip in Newark, I want to go back to my other grandmother. 1960. I am 5.5 years old, and my Nana had a button. And the button, which I later understood, said Kennedy. And I said, Nana, what is this button? She says, oh, it's a political button. Nice young man, handsome young man, but he'll never be president. He'll never be president because no papist would ever be a president, is what she told me. She said, don't worry, no Jew either. No papist will ever be president. What, in my 5-year-old mind, could a papist possibly be? What could it be so terrible to eliminate this nice young man with the button that I got a button that I could wear? What is it that he was that was so horrible? What he was Catholic, and he followed the Pope. And President Kennedy showed us you can be attached to your religion. You can believe in it. You can believe in its leaders like the Pope and still give us a good presidency. President Kennedy, who was, of course, elected in that election, became the first Catholic. Jews were shocked because they knew that no Jew could ever be president. Lately, we found that no woman either. So John F. Kennedy becomes the president. And he is not only a liberal, he is an open, unabashed liberal. And he says this, I am a liberal and I follow those things. And for those of us whose John F. Kennedy remains our hero, we still believe in that. I wish his grandnephew Robert believed in that, but Robert's father, John F. Kennedy's brother, was truly the smartest man of his generation. I can't believe he didn't pass it down in the same way. Nevertheless. So what we saw after Kennedy's assassination and after the most powerful man of the 20th century, arguably the most powerful man of the 20th century, Lyndon Baines Johnson, became the vice president and later the president, was the breakdown of the middle and the breakdown of this liberal tradition. People like Mike Mansfield, Senate leadership. And the radicals moved into that power vacuum, encouraging all kinds of violence. The civil rights movement of the 40s, 50s, and early 60s was a moderate movement. They sustained injuries. They didn't cause them. The civil rights movement of the late 1960s into the 70s was one of violence. Violence in Watts, which is now Compton. Violence in Newark. Violence throughout. Literally taking out the leader of the civil rights movement, murdered where he stood, on a balcony of the Lorraine Motel. The Lorraine Motel is now the National Civil Rights Museum, and if you haven't been there, you need to go there and take your kids there. There's the balcony. There's with Jesse Jackson and all of those people, the mayor of Atlanta, the to-be mayor of Atlanta. I still haven't gotten over that, and I hope I never will. He was snatched from us when his moderate approach would have been it. But it was already a change because the SLCC began to move to the radicalism. And Stokely Carmichael took over that organization. And he kicked out a lot of people from the organization. The people he kicked out included me and my cousin, who was a college student at the time. And he kicked us out for the right reasons. We were the wrong color. He didn't care about the coalition. He didn't care about how in New Jersey we felt allied. He cared about Afrocentric leadership, and that's where everything went. And he put his radical thoughts and his radical thumbs on that scale, and the civil rights movement began to become part of radicalism. And what we got from that radicalism was violence, death, rioting, fire. And that activity is going on today. Today, we need to get back to this moderate movement. And we need to be willing to fight for that moderation. We need to understand what happens when we lose it. And as such, we need to not lose it. Or else Dr. King died in vain. Died in vain. He fought for moderation, as did Gandhi, his hero, as did other people from my generation. But the boomers themselves were not moderates. The boomers in the 1960s and 70s, with the Vietnam War raging, were radicals. And it was those radicals, the Weather Underground, Students for a Democratic Society, people like that are now the people in power. And so when I said to you, blame it on the boomers, which my grown son would definitely do, I'm not lying. We looked at things from a radical approach. We assumed something was wrong. To this day, I'm one of the very few people who believe that the Kennedy assassination was done by a lone assassin, and that all the problems that we have can be attributed to organizations that played with the same people. The assassin of John F. Kennedy worked for both the KGB and the FBI, if that doesn't tell you something. Both sides began to lie because they were afraid the other was going to blame them. And so they created this illusion that it was a conspiracy. Maybe it was, and I'm wrong. But I think that the history, as we talked about last week, the history of the 20th century is that of the lone wolf changing the direction of politics. And that's what happened. We loved Kennedy. He could make mistakes with the military, as happened in the Bay of Pigs. But Lyndon Baines Johnson was not the same. And when Johnson started sending tens of thousands of American soldiers to win a war that was unwinnable, to win a war that couldn't be won, that changed the position of the baby boom generation from a moderate coalition-based grouping to radicals who knew that their radicalism was right. And that, in it, going back to these times, is what happened. Because the election of Barry Goldwater in 1964, or the election, was actually the election of LBJ, but Goldwater was a little far to the right. And although the far right was being squeezed out of the Democratic Party at that time, they were still part of the Democratic Party. They had a political voice, and those people who become MAGA, who become the radicals, those haters, those are the ones who are really generating. And so when we look at the riots going on in Los Angeles now, this background goes back to Compton, goes back to the Watts riots, goes back to the Newark riots, because it was the only way that people could have their voice be heard. They were intentionally being shut out. There were only 3 networks, and everybody listened to Walter Cronkite, and everybody listened to Huntley and Brinkley, and not each other. Moderates listen to each other. And that's what we need you to do. Start listening and coalitioning with each other. That's how we're going to get ahead. I worked with people at a local university, and they have a labor institute at Florida International University, FIU, in Miami. And they talked about an idea that was being passed around in leadership of the unions in America. And they said there are 2 different schools of thought. In one school of thought, how you do it, fairness, is the most important thing. In another school of thought, what you do is most important. What the Republicans, after Barry Goldwater, wanted to do more than anything else was win elections. And so they began to build the infrastructure for their right-wing rise. These included colleges and universities who would say what they wanted them to say, electing people who were farther right, supporting causes like open use of guns and anti-abortion activities. These radical actions caused a coalition of the 2 parties that were separate. They went with their people, but they didn't work with each other. And the days of LBJ and Mike Mansfield as the leaders of the Senate, finding coalition, finding common ground, had long. We came into the eras of Ronald Reagan, of Donald Trump. I want it this way. Well, what the conservatives wanted more than anything else was to win, And so they began to build the infrastructure, not because it was right. And they began to make fun of and attack the liberals and their believing in what was right. Do you believe that what is right is most important, or do you believe that winning is most important? Because the Republican Party believed that winning was the most important. The Democrats claim, maybe they were right, maybe they weren't, that they still believed in this idea. And so the chasm between the parties began to be wider. Into those chasms were almost half of the party faithful, Democrats and Republicans, who separated from their party as the parties became more radical, and they became the independents. There are now as many independents as there are members of the political parties. And one of those parties, the Republicans, continues to shed people. The Republican Party won in 2024, most likely, because of Latino support. Certainly in Florida and in the Rust Belt states, the Latino support was critical. That support is never coming back to the MAGA Republicans. They being chased and attacked, being arrested with American citizenship and ID on you. And they said, no, we're taking you to jail anyhow. We'll decide if you belong here or not. Obviously, if they spoke Spanish or English with a Spanish accent, they didn't belong in America. Wait a minute. America, the land of immigrants, the original people here. The United States of America did not pop out as an English-speaking country. It started mostly as a piece of the Spanish Empire, later becoming elements of free Latino populations. Mexico was robbed of what would become 4 states: California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. Robbed. Well, the Gadsden Purchase. After the war was over, we said, okay, well, we want this little piece here too, and we'll pay for that. Yeah, that's not the America that little kid putting a Kennedy button on his shirt wanted to grow up in. The America that we as the baby boomers were promised never materialized. There's a Bellamy Brothers song that he thought back in the 60s. This is an old hippie, the song is called. He believed back in the 60s that everyone was hip, and they sent him off to Vietnam on his senior trip. As a teacher, a professor at Broward College, about 10% of the people coming in were Asians, most of whom were coming from Vietnam. And it's necessary, before I start as a teacher talking about that war with those Vietnamese who only know the propaganda that they had. I said, as you look at the studies of this war in the United States, you will see that it's said that 58,000, maybe 59,000 died. Those numbers are incorrect. The actual numbers in the Vietnam War were 2 to 3 million people of both sides, plus foreign advisors, were killed as a result of that war. And if you include the nearby countries, including Cambodia and Thailand, the numbers rise to 5 to 7 million people. 5 to 7 million people. That is genocide. That is not acceptable. But I have a more personal piece, because my friends who went to war, not all of them came back. Some of them are and remain teenagers, never to be anything else in their lives because of that terrible war. My wife's husband died because of his exposure to Agent Orange before VA was taking care of people with that. They just spent their time denying that it was the American government's fault. This is the legacy of the Vietnam War. But there is another legacy, and that is the lack of belief in government and institutions, and that's forming the radicalism that's separating the parties, pushing the independents to a leadership role, which they're not taking advantage of. The independents aren't running people. There aren't people who are running for that. There is somebody in Florida, David Jolly, currently running, who is a former Republican, now running as a Democrat. Maybe he'll draw independents. We'll see. I'm interested to watch. But I think we need to calm the fuck down. Calm the fuck down and take back our country as a place where immigrants are welcome, where all people have a chance, where everybody plays on a level playing field. No such thing as a level playing field. But at least it's close. At least we're moving towards that. And we may not have been for a long time. But we are now, or we were, until these radical views have come in and they have begun to separate us again. I have talked about, I have a family member who's transgender. And so he doesn't want to compete against women in sports. He would love to play sports where he is good. And it's not about taking a record away from someone else, as Republicans and MAGA are talking about. It is about he is a wonderful young man and deserves every opportunity a young man has, some of which includes sports. It's not unreasonable, and it's not unacceptable. And sometimes we have to take these ideas a little further. As we began to look at Obama's second term, we began to realize something very important, that the primary voters in the African American community were voting against abortion and reproductive rights issues. They came back and said, well, we believe in traditional morals and don't believe in gay, what have you. The Democratic Party smartly sent people into the communities through the churches to remind those people about what on the down low means and about the large part of the African American population that is involved in gay sex. Nothing wrong with that. There are discussions about why. Does it come from the over-jailing of the population and jailhouse, or is it something else? Personally, I believe it's something else. But once the African American mothers began to realize these were their sons and their nephews and the kid down the street, they immediately came back and supported everything else going on. It had to be explained to them. They never realized before that those gay children included their own. We start with agreeing that we work for and in the same country. We start by stopping vilifying fairness. And one of the parties has taken a different tack. And I don't like to, because I'm a moderate and I support many Republicans, I have to say that there is chicanery going on. This includes how apportionment, reapportionment, and distribution is set up. And the Republicans have, with this machine they built, cheated. We talk about the conservative court. The conservative court, which is a 6-3 majority, is actually shouldn't have been. It should have been 4-4 and a moderate. But when they chose not to allow the person to be replaced in a timely fashion, and they were able to gain the upper hand and put in a radical Republican who didn't care about people, didn't care about our forefathers, and the Supreme Court at this point has been corrupted. It's corrupted in money, it's corrupted in decisions, it's corrupted every way you can. There is no choice but to change the Supreme Court to get us back to a moderate stance. On the other hand, if one side hadn't cheated on the other, we wouldn't have to be that way. But because the Republicans cheated, we're going to have to look at how people like Thomas and Roberts receive gifts and how they report it and when they report it. And if they're going to give us answers that we accept, they have to give us answers that we'll decide if we accept. And corruption is not allowed, especially by the judicial system. When the radicals came to power, encouraging this violence, lie, cheat, and steal became the way that the Republicans came to power. I think they could have won on their own, but they didn't wait. They wanted to win so bad that they were willing to give up their morals. The Democrats, I don't want to let them off scot-free either, because they haven't done the right thing either. And they have also accepted their extremists as leadership, and in doing that, endangered our country, endangered the Republic. More than that, the independents' lack of involvement and lack of participation in a binary system is also endangering the country. All of these things are pushing us towards a radical approach. And they've pushed us so far that they're out there shooting our politicians, out there shooting our politicians. Some of the scars of the Newark riots are still there on Springfield Avenue. But more importantly, some of the scars exist within what we've been able to accomplish and what we haven't been able to accomplish because we're not standing together, because we're not locked arm in arm, because we're not the coalitions that the liberals fought for. Let's talk about immigration and fairness. Immigration is happening as it's happening now because there is a worldwide movement of people. It isn't that Democrats have opened the gates. There's no opening of the gates. There's fairness and policies that were established as fairness that the Republicans wanted us to lie, cheat, and steal and go back on. The intention of why the borders were closed was a medical emergency. Okay? And we did it for that. But beyond that, that emergency passed and they wanted it back. We want to act like it's an emergency. Well, I'm glad you do, but it's not. And fairness says we've got to come up with a better way. They said, well, we're not going to help. And so the Republicans, when we tried to tighten up the border from the Democratic side, the Republicans stepped in and stopped it. I understand, but I don't approve, and I don't forgive you. Destruction of the liberal coalition for civil rights is what broke us apart. But some of the other actions, including the rise of black power and black nationalism, it was no better when it was that than it is now with the MAGA people who are rising to power and given positions of authority with the sole purpose of taking things away from communities and people. Another part of the breakup between the coalition between whites and blacks, between Jews and blacks, were the Ocean Hill and Brownsville teacher strikes, which were called by the black people of their time and the leaders, the radical leaders, an affront to the community. And yet the teachers who had been promised a lifetime job being fired had no bearing on that, except they had intentionally, to break us up, fired Jewish teachers and replaced them with black teachers and fought that in the unions. Well, the Jews at that time, not so much now, but at that time, fought for the unions and stood with the unions as part of who they coalitioned with. Think of how powerful Jews, blacks, and the unions were as a coalition. When that coalition broke, think of how happy the other side was. Attacks by conservatives against liberal ideology, the main point was politically motivated. These attacks were not because there was anything wrong on what they were doing. They were because they wanted to do something bad. They screamed and hollered when the wife of Barack Obama wore a sleeveless dress. And they voted en masse to a man who didn't have the moral authority that Barack Obama did. And the woman, the First Lady, who certainly didn't have a circumspect relationship with the media. So, congratulations, everybody. We're in an extremist country. Is that what you want? Is that what you need? Is that how the children should grow up? Well, if it isn't, I need you to participate with us. We are the moderates, and we're taking it back at the Pivot Point. The Pivot Point podcast is an opportunity for moderates to begin to take back their leadership and their control. So what I'm asking you of the Pivot Point to start to do is to talk to your own coalitions, is to reformulate these coalitions, is to speak in your community groups, in your civic groups, in your schools, with each other about how we make this a better place. The last thing I want in new political leadership is attacking the state and our region's biggest employer. I still am allied with Walt Disney and Roy Disney and the families that come from that. I am proud of what we found out when the Reedy Creek debacle came out, and that Disney had been doing the right thing, paying more than their share, giving great services to the people of Central Florida. Disney deserves our support from that. It had had it up until DeSantis took it away. It's time to take it back from DeSantis. I do not want DeSantis' wife, who stole money and gave it to people illegally, including her husband, into power. I don't care if it's a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent. I'm looking at Jolly and wondering, is that going to be it? But I do care right now if that person is a moderate versus a radical. I care that the opportunities for business in my state, the opportunities for education in my state, are coming back to its people. Attacking education is done by people who are doing things that they don't want other people to understand. Because the educated are going to say, hey, the emperor, I can see it. He's got no clothes on. No. It's not an invisible suit. The emperor has no clothes. That's an expression from the 50s, but I think you get it now. And we need to take back control of politics ourselves. So I'm asking you to join with us as part of Pivot Point. I'm asking you to watch. It's taking a little longer than we had hoped to get the events together, but they are coming. Keep listening. Keep enjoying. We're going to have events in a very few weeks that I can announce. You have the emails for us, and you can see it in the graphics below. And so call us, email us, send us your video, send us your ideas, send us what you think. Because when we take back the middle, we're not just taking it back for us, we're taking it back for you. And if you don't tell us what you think is the middle, if you don't tell us what you think is important, then boo on you. If we don't know, we can't try and find a way to coalition. And we're going to coalition. But I have a promise for you who are terrified of riots in the streets and demonstrations for no kings and murders of politicians. I have good news for you. I can absolutely say this as a student, as a professor, as an author, as a podcaster. At some point, the Democrats are coming back. The moderates are coming back. The choices are coming back. The question is when? And what are you willing to do to bring these choices back? I know some of you wanted some of these ideas from our Republican leadership. That's okay. Nothing wrong with wanting those ideas. When you weren't willing to compromise on it, and when you used methods that were not based on fairness to get these things, they are no longer what you wanted. What you got was the things that you can steal, rob, fool people to get. I don't want that. We all know about Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is always the best. The radicals want their way. The moderates want this done in fairness. If we looked at the union leadership, they care about what their leadership accomplished. If you look at Democratic Party leadership, they wanted fairness. You know what? Trying to move too far to one side or the other of that balance beam is why our unions have lost their punch and our Democratic Party is falling. We need to get it back. I'm not telling you to vote Democrat. I'm not telling you to vote Republican. I'm not telling you to be a radical. I'm not telling you to be a moderate. I am telling you to be a moderate. But I'm telling you to act in a way that is moderate. And that will get us better things for our families. And you know what? I got a bunch of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and I'm willing to fight for them. I'm willing to do anything for them. I'm willing to even coalition with Republican people to get my children better education. That's where I stand. And if I'm going to be attacked for it, well, you come on. Because I want what's best for America. I want the promise of our founding fathers. I read on the first episode the letter George Washington sent to the Jewish congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, and how he promised to each of us our own tree and our own fig leaf. I want that promise. And I owe it to George Washington to fight hard and get it back. And so I'm going to be here on your stations. Please join us again next week for Pivot Point, and join us as the events begin to take place. We're all going to do this together. I want to hear what you have to say. If you send it to me, it's going on the air. Thank you all. This is Barry Sacharow. Have a wonderful week.